What I'm about to tell you happened in 1996, in a place where nightmares weren't supposed to exist. Picture Millfield, Oregon, population 3,000 on a good day. Before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more stories like this. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone, where kids ride bikes without helmets, and parents never think twice about letting their children walk alone to the corner store. This was America's heartland at its finest. White picket fences, lined tree-shaded streets. The high school football team was the pride of the community. On Friday nights, the whole town would pack into the bleachers to cheer on their boys. Saturday mornings meant little league games and church bake sales. Sunday afternoons were for family barbecues and lazy conversations over backyard fences. Main Street stretched for exactly 12 blocks. You had Murphy's hardware store, where old-timers gathered every morning to solve the world's problems over coffee and donuts. There was Millfield Market, run by the same family for 3 generations. The post office sat right next to the library, both housed in buildings that hadn't changed since the 1940s. But right in the heart of it all, like a spider in the center of its web, sat Hayes Family Diner. Red brick building with oversized windows, facing the street. A neon sign that buzzed just a little too loud, casting an eerie glow on rainy nights. The moment you pushed through that heavy glass door, the smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee would hit you like a warm embrace. This wasn't just any small-town restaurant. This was the beating heart of Millfield. The place where mill workers grabbed their morning coffee before facing another brutal 12-hour shift. Where high school sweethearts shared milkshakes and made promises they thought would last forever. Where families celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and every other milestone that mattered. The owner of this community gathering place was a man named Robert Hayes, 42 years old, born and raised in Millfield. Average height, maybe 5'8", with the soft build of a man who spent his days around food instead of manual labor. He had thinning brown hair that he combed carefully over a growing bald spot, and he always wore the same uniform: flannel shirts in winter, polo shirts in summer, always paired with well-worn jeans and comfortable sneakers. To look at Robert Hayes, you'd forget him 5 seconds after walking past him on the street. He was the definition of ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of middle-aged man who blended into the background of everyday life. But that ordinariness was his greatest weapon, though nobody knew it yet. Hayes had this gift, and I use that word very carefully, for making people feel comfortable around him. He remembered every customer's usual order, even if they only came in once a month. He'd ask about their kids by name, remember their birthdays, inquire about their jobs or their health problems. When Mrs. Peterson's husband was in the hospital with pneumonia, Hayes sent over a free meal every single day. When the high school football team made it to the state playoffs, he personally delivered coffee and sandwiches to the players' parents who were camping out in the parking lot for tickets. In a town like Millfield, your local diner owner wasn't just someone who served you food. He was a confidant, a friend, almost like extended family. People trusted Robert Hayes with their secrets, their problems, their children. They never imagined that behind his friendly smile and concerned questions lurked something unspeakably evil. Let me tell you about 2 boys who were about to walk straight into hell, though they had no way of knowing it. Michael Thompson and Danny Rodriguez, both 14 years old, both best friends since they'd met in Mrs. Anderson's 3rd grade class 6 years earlier. These weren't privileged kids from the wealthy side of town. Michael's father, David Thompson, worked double shifts at Morrison Lumber Mill just to keep the lights on and food on the table. His mother, Patricia, cleaned houses for the doctors and lawyers who lived in the fancy neighborhood up on Hillcrest Drive. Every dollar mattered in the Thompson household. Danny's situation was similar. His father, Carlos Rodriguez, had immigrated from Mexico 15 years earlier, working construction jobs and saving every penny to bring his family to America. Danny's mother, Maria, worked nights at the hospital as a cleaning lady. The Rodriguez family knew what it meant to struggle for the American dream. When summer break arrived in June of 1996, most kids Michael and Danny's age were thinking about swimming pools, video games, and sleeping late. But these boys had different priorities. They understood that their families needed help, and they were mature enough to sacrifice their summer vacation to contribute to the household income. Morrison Lumber Mill, located about 3 miles outside of town, was hiring temporary summer workers. The job was physically demanding, loading trucks with heavy lumber, stacking boards in precise piles, cleaning up sawdust and wood scraps at the end of each shift. The work paid $6 an hour, which was decent money for teenagers in 1996. More importantly, it was honest work that would teach them responsibility and give them a sense of pride. Michael made the decision first. He walked into the mill's front office on a Monday morning in early June, filled out an application, and was hired on the spot. When he told Danny about the job, his best friend didn't hesitate to apply as well. By Wednesday, both boys were part of the summer crew. Every morning at exactly 5:45 a.m., Michael and Danny would meet at the corner of Elm and 3rd Street to catch the workers' bus, a converted school bus painted yellow that transported mill employees from town to the work site. The bus was always packed with men who looked like they'd been doing this kind of work their entire lives. Men with calloused hands and sun-weathered faces, men who carried their lunch in metal boxes and talked about things like overtime pay and union benefits. At first, the older workers looked at these two skinny teenagers with skepticism. What did a couple of kids know about real work? But Michael and Danny proved themselves quickly. They showed up on time every day, never complained about the heat or the heavy lifting, and always volunteered for the jobs nobody else wanted. Within 2 weeks, the veteran mill workers had accepted them as equals. The 12-hour shifts were brutal, especially during the hottest part of summer. Oregon might not be known for extreme heat, but when the temperature hit 90 degrees and you're working in direct sunlight, loading lumber that's been baking in the sun all day, those hours felt endless. By quitting time at 6 p.m., both boys would be covered in sawdust, soaked with sweat, and exhausted to their bones. But they were proud of what they were doing. They were contributing to their family's financial stability. They were learning what it meant to earn an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. And they were doing it together, best friends facing the challenges of growing up side by side. The bus ride back to town at the end of each shift became a time for them to decompress and plan their evenings. Most nights, they were too tired to do much besides shower, eat dinner, and collapse into bed. But lunch breaks during the workday became their opportunity to feel like normal teenagers again. At first, they brought sandwiches from home, usually peanut butter and jelly or bologna and cheese, packed in brown paper bags along with an apple and a juice box. But as their first paychecks started coming in, they decided to treat themselves occasionally to lunch in town. It was only a half-mile walk from the mill to Main Street, and they had a full hour for their lunch break. Sometimes they'd go to Murphy's Market and grab pre-made sandwiches from the deli counter. Sometimes they'd hit the taco truck that parked near the courthouse, serving authentic Mexican food that reminded Danny of his grandmother's cooking. But more and more often, as the summer progressed, they found themselves pushing through the glass door of Hayes' family diner. Robert Hayes took notice of Michael and Danny from their very first visit. Here were two polite, hard-working kids who said please and thank you, who cleaned up after themselves, and who always left a small tip even though they were clearly watching every penny. In a business where you dealt with demanding customers and messy children all day long, these boys were a breath of fresh air. "You boys working over at the mill?" Hayes asked during their second visit, wiping down their table with a damp cloth, while they looked over the menu. "Yes, sir," Michael replied. "Just for the summer. Trying to help out our family." Hayes smiled warmly. "That's admirable. Not many kids your age have that kind of work ethic. What can I get you today?" It seemed like such an innocent conversation, just a friendly restaurant owner making small talk with his customers. But looking back now, knowing what we know, that was probably the moment when Hayes identified his targets. Two boys, working away from town, with predictable schedules and limited supervision. Two boys who would trust an adult who showed them kindness and respect. The relationship developed gradually over the following weeks. Hayes started giving them larger portions without charging extra. He'd forget to add their drinks to the bill. When business was slow, he'd sit with them and chat about their work, their families, their plans for high school. He seemed genuinely interested in their lives, like a caring uncle or family friend. "Michael, you're good with numbers, right?" Hayes said one afternoon in late June. Ever think about maybe studying business in college? Running a restaurant takes a lot of math skills, inventory, payroll, profit margins. I could teach you some things if you're interested. Michael's eyes lit up. Here was an adult who took him seriously, who saw potential in him beyond just being a kid who could stack lumber. That would be great, Mr. Hayes. I'd really like to learn about business. Hayes turned to Danny. You, son, you've got an artistic eye. I've seen you doodling in those notebooks you carry. Ever think about designing menus, advertising materials, maybe even restaurant layouts? The food business needs creative people, too. Danny beamed with pride. At home, his parents were supportive but too busy working multiple jobs to really focus on his interests. At school, teachers saw him as just another Hispanic kid from the wrong side of town. But Mr. Hayes saw something special in him, something worth nurturing and developing. This was classic predator behavior, though the boys had no way of recognizing it. Hayes was studying them, learning their personalities, their vulnerabilities, their desires. He was building trust and dependency, making himself indispensable in their lives. Every compliment, every free meal, every piece of fatherly advice was a calculated move in a game that only he knew he was playing. The conversations gradually became more personal. Hayes would ask about their home lives, when their parents worked, when they'd be home alone, what their weekend plans were. He'd probe gently about their friendships with other kids, almost as if he was jealous of the time they spent with anyone else. You boys don't hang out with other kids from school? He asked one day in early July. Not much during the summer, Danny replied. Most of our friends are either at camp or just hanging out at home playing video games. We don't really have time for that stuff. Good for you, Hayes said approvingly. Shows you've got your priorities straight. Lot of kids your age are just wasting their summer, but you two are building character, learning valuable lessons. I respect that. The praise felt good. These boys were working 12-hour days in dangerous conditions, earning money to help their struggling families. And here was an adult who recognized and appreciated their sacrifice. Hayes made them feel special, mature, important. As July progressed, Hayes started offering them rides home when they missed the evening workers' bus. The first time it happened, it seemed perfectly innocent. The boys had lingered at the diner a little too long, listening to Hayes tell stories about his days working in the logging industry. And by the time they realized what time it was, the 6 p.m. bus had already left. Don't worry about it, Hayes said, untying his apron. I'm closing up anyway. I'll drive you home. His red Ford pickup truck had a bench seat that could fit 3 people across the front. Michael climbed in by the passenger door. Danny slid into the middle, and Hayes got behind the wheel. During that first ride, he was the perfect gentleman. He asked about their families, complimented them on their work ethic, even stopped at a gas station to buy them each a Coke for the road. When he dropped them off at Michael's house, a small, well-maintained home on Maple Street, Hayes rolled down his window and called out, "You boys ever need a ride, you just let me know. Happy to help out." Over the next 2 weeks, these rides became more frequent. Sometimes the boys would deliberately stay late at the diner, knowing Hayes would offer to drive them home. He'd take the scenic route sometimes, showing them parts of Millfield they'd never seen, pointing out where he'd grown up, where he'd gone to school, sharing stories about the town's history. "See that old house up on the hill?" he said one evening, pointing to a Victorian mansion that had seen better days. That used to belong to the mill owner back in the 1920s. Had 7 bedrooms, 4 fireplaces, even an indoor bathroom when most folks in town were still using outhouses. During the Depression, he lost everything and had to sell it to the bank. Shows you how fast things can change. The boys listened intently to these stories. Hayes was like a living history book. Someone who could make the past come alive with vivid details and personal anecdotes. He made them feel like they were being let in on secrets that other kids their age would never hear. But there were signs, subtle warnings that something wasn't quite right. Hayes began keeping them at the diner later and later, finding excuses to extend their visits. He'd say he needed help cleaning up, or that he wanted to teach them about restaurant management, or that he had some particularly interesting story to share. The boys, flattered by the attention, never questioned these delays. He also became possessive of their time and attention. If they mentioned eating lunch somewhere else, he'd seem hurt almost betrayed. "I thought we were friends," he'd say. Or, "I was looking forward to seeing you guys today. I even saved you some of that chocolate pie you like." Hayes started asking increasingly personal questions too. He wanted to know details about their families' schedules, when their parents worked, when they'd be home alone, what their weekend plans were. He'd probe for information about their friendships with other kids, seeming jealous of any time they spent with people their own age. The conversations during their rides home began taking uncomfortable turns as well. Hayes would bring up topics that made the boys squirm, asking if they had girlfriends, making comments about their physical development, telling inappropriate jokes that were just barely on the wrong side of acceptable. Nothing overtly dangerous, but enough to make Michael and Danny exchange questioning glances sometimes. But these were just kids, remember. 14-year-old boys from working-class families who had been taught to respect adults and not question, or authority figures. In their minds, Robert Hayes was just a lonely guy who enjoyed their company. Maybe he was a little odd, but he'd been nothing but kind to them. He fed them, gave them rides, treated them better than most adults in their lives. How could they possibly suspect that behind his friendly smile lurked a monster planning something unspeakable? July 23rd, 1996. It was a Tuesday, and the weather had been absolutely brutal all week. One of those heat waves that settles over the Pacific Northwest like a suffocating blanket, pushing temperatures into the mid-90s, with humidity levels that made it feel even worse. Working conditions at the lumber mill were almost unbearable. Michael and Danny had put in their full 12 hours, loading truck after truck with heavy boards that had been baking in the sun all day. The lumber was so hot you could barely touch it with bare hands. Both boys had gone through multiple bottles of water, and their work clothes were completely soaked with sweat. Their hands were raw from handling rough wood. Their backs ached from constant lifting, and all they could think about was getting somewhere with air conditioning. The 5:30 workers' bus seemed to take forever to reach town, the old converted school. Bus had no air conditioning, just windows that you could crack open for a breeze that felt more like a hairdryer than relief from the heat. By the time they reached Main Street, both boys looked like they'd been put through a wringer. "Man, I need something cold to drink," Michael said as they climbed off the bus. "And I need to sit somewhere that's not 100 degrees. Hayes family." "Diner?" Danny suggested, though he really didn't need to ask. It had become their routine over the past month. Catch the bus into town, grab lunch or dinner at Hayes's place, then either catch the evening bus home or get a ride from Hayes himself. The diner's air conditioning hit them like a blessing the moment they pushed through the front door. After 12 hours in the blazing sun, the cool, dry air felt almost miraculous. Hayes looked up from behind the counter and smiled. That same warm, welcoming smile they'd seen hundreds of times before. "There are my favorite customers," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "You boys look like you've been through hell. Today, take a seat wherever you want, and I'll get you something cold to drink." They slid into their usual booth in the back corner, red vinyl seats that were patched with duct tape in a few places, a formica table that wobbled slightly if you put too much weight on one side, and a perfect view of the parking lot through the window. Hayes brought them each a large Coke without being asked. Extra ice, exactly the way they liked it. The dinner rush was just winding down. A few construction workers sat at the counter, probably coming off their own brutal day in the heat. An elderly couple shared a piece of apple pie in the booth by the front window. A young mother was trying to convince her toddler to eat his chicken nuggets. Nothing out of the ordinary for a Tuesday evening in Millfield. But there was something different about Hayes that night. He seemed nervous, agitated, distracted. He kept glancing toward the front windows, checking his watch, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. When he brought their food, their usual cheeseburgers and fries, he lingered at their table longer than normal. "How's the work going at the mill?" he asked, sliding into the booth across from them. "You boys learning a lot?" "It's tough work," Michael replied, "but we're getting stronger, and the money's good." "That's great to hear. You're both turning into real men, working hard like that. Your parents must be proud." Hayes paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "What are you boys doing this weekend? Any special plans?" It was an innocent enough question, but something about the way he asked it made both boys feel slightly uncomfortable. There was an intensity in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a focus that felt almost predatory. "Not much," Danny answered. "Probably just sleeping late on Saturday. Maybe going to the community pool if it's still this hot." "Sounds nice," Hayes said, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You boys are lucky to have such simple pleasures. Not everyone gets to enjoy that kind of innocence." The word innocence hung in the air strangely. Neither boy could put their finger on why, but something about the comment felt wrong, inappropriate somehow. They finished their meals quickly, suddenly eager to get home. By 8 p.m. the diner was empty, except for the three of them. Hayes had sent his one waitress home early, saying business was slow and there was no point in paying her to stand around. He busied himself with his end-of-day routine, wiping down tables, refilling ketchup bottles, counting the money in the register. Michael and Danny knew this meant it was time to go. They'd watched this routine dozens of times before. But when they looked outside, they realized the last worker's bus had left at 7:30. They were facing that long walk home through some pretty dark woods, and after the exhausting day they'd had, the thought of a 3-mile hike was almost unbearable. "You boys need a ride?" Hayes asked, as if reading their minds. He was flipping the sign on the front door from open to closed, the neon light casting strange shadows on his face. "I'm heading out anyway. Might as well drop you off." They accepted gratefully, just like they had so many times before. It seemed perfectly natural, perfectly safe. Hayes had driven them home at least a dozen times over the past month. He'd always been a perfect gentleman, always taken them straight home, always made sure they got inside safely before driving away. They walked out the back door of the diner, to where Hayes's red Ford pickup was parked under a flickering streetlight. Michael climbed into the passenger seat, Danny slid into the middle, and Hayes got behind the wheel. The engine started with a low rumble, and Hayes pulled out of the parking lot onto Main Street. But instead of turning left toward their neighborhood like he always did, Hayes turned right onto Highway 26, heading away from town toward the National Forest. When Danny asked where they were going, Hayes kept his eyes on the road and said he needed to make a quick stop. "I've got some equipment at my hunting cabin that I need to pick up," he said calmly. "Won't take long, and then I'll get you boys home." Michael and Danny weren't immediately alarmed. Hayes often talked about his hunting trips, his knowledge of the local wilderness areas, his cabin in the woods where he went to get away from the stress of running a business. It seemed reasonable that he might need to stop by and grab something before taking them home. But as they drove deeper into the national forest, farther and farther away from any houses or main roads, both boys started to feel uneasy. The sun was setting behind the tall Douglas fir trees, casting long, ominous shadows across the narrow highway. Hayes's headlights cut through the growing darkness as they climbed higher into the mountains. "How much farther?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Not far now," Hayes replied. But there was something different in his tone, something cold and distant that neither boy had ever heard before. About 20 minutes into the drive, Hayes turned onto Forest Service Road 47, a narrow dirt track that wound through some of the densest, most isolated wilderness in the area. The truck bounced and lurched over potholes and tree roots, headlights sweeping across towering evergreens that seemed to close in around them like the walls of a tunnel. Both boys were fully alert now, their earlier exhaustion replaced by a growing sense of danger. This wasn't the way to any hunting cabin. This was leading them deeper and deeper into the middle of nowhere, farther from help than they'd ever been in their lives. "Mr. Hayes," Danny said, his voice tight with anxiety, "maybe you should just take us home. It's getting pretty late, and our parents will be worried." Hayes didn't respond. He just kept driving deeper into the forest, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, his face looked different. Harder, more focused, like a mask had finally been removed to reveal something terrible underneath. Hayes finally pulled the truck over at a small clearing surrounded by massive Douglas fir trees. The spot was completely isolated. No roads visible in any direction, no houses, no signs of human presence except for the dirt track they'd followed to get there. He turned off the engine, and suddenly the forest was eerily quiet. No traffic sounds, no voices, just the distant hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind through the branches overhead. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Hayes sat motionless behind the wheel, staring straight ahead into the darkness beyond the headlights. Michael and Danny exchanged terrified glances, both of them now fully aware that something was terribly wrong. When Hayes finally turned to face them, the transformation was complete. The friendly smile was gone, replaced by something cold and predatory. His eyes had a flat, emotionless quality that made both boys' skin crawl. When he started talking, his voice was different too, lower, more intense, like he was a completely different person. "You boys have been very special to me," he said slowly, savoring each word. "Very special. And now it's time for you to show me just how grateful you are for all the kindness I've shown you." What he said next made both boys realize they were in mortal danger. Hayes started making suggestions that were completely inappropriate, describing things that made their stomachs turn. This wasn't the man who had fed them lunch and given them fatherly advice for the past month. This was a predator who had been wearing a mask, and now the mask was off. Danny, who was sitting closest to the driver's side door, reacted first. Adrenaline and terror gave him speed he didn't know he possessed. He fumbled for the door handle, managed to get it open, and bolted from the truck. His sneakers hit the forest floor running, and he disappeared into the darkness between the trees without looking back. Michael tried to follow his friend, but Hayes was quicker. The man grabbed Michael's wrist and pulled him back toward the truck, with surprising strength. The boy was strong from his work at the lumber mill, but Hayes was a grown man driven by something dark and desperate. "Where do you think you're going?" Hayes snarled, his grip tightening around Michael's arm. "We're not finished here. Not even close." Michael fought with everything he had. He punched, kicked, screamed for help, tried to break free from Hayes' grip. But they were miles from anyone who could hear him, and Hayes seemed to possess inhuman strength, fueled by whatever sickness had been growing inside him. What happened next in that isolated clearing was every parent's worst nightmare. Despite Michael's screams and desperate struggles, despite his pleas for mercy, Hayes was determined to silence the boy permanently. The attack was brutal and swift, driven by a rage that seemed to come from some bottomless pit of darkness. Somewhere in the woods, maybe 50 yards away, Danny was pressed against the rough bark of a massive Douglas fir, listening to sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Every instinct told him to run back and try to save his best friend, but he was just a 14-year-old boy, terrified and alone in the dark forest, facing a man who had clearly lost his mind. Danny forced himself to stay hidden, tears streaming down his face as he listened to his friend's cries for help gradually fade into silence. He wanted to scream, to run, to do something, anything to help Michael, but terror kept him frozen, in place, knowing that if Hayes found him, he would suffer the same fate. When the horrible sounds finally stopped, an eerie silence fell over the forest. Danny waited, hardly daring to breathe, wondering if Hayes was searching for him in the darkness. Minutes passed, like hours. He could hear movement in the clearing, footsteps, the sound of the truck door opening and closing, the engine starting, up. Through the trees, Danny could see the red glow of the truck's taillights as Hayes drove away, taking Michael's body with him. But Danny didn't move from his hiding spot. What if this was a trick? What if Hayes was coming back? What if he was out there in the darkness right now, waiting for Danny to show him? Danny spent the longest night of his life crouched behind that tree, terrified and in shock. Every sound made him jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the hoot of an owl that sounded almost human in the darkness. When dawn finally came, painting the forest in shades of grey and gold, he was still too scared to move. It wasn't until the sun was fully up, and he could hear the distant sound of traffic on Highway 26, that Danny finally found the courage to leave his hiding place. Weak from dehydration and terror, scratched and bleeding from pushing through thick underbrush, he began the long journey back to civilization, knowing that his best friend was dead and that a monster was walking free in his hometown. Meanwhile, Hayes had driven back to Millfield with Michael's body in the bed of his pickup truck, covered by a tarp he kept for hauling supplies. The drive through the quiet streets must have been surreal. Here was a man who had just committed an unthinkable act, driving past houses where families were settling in for the night, watching television, helping kids with homework, living normal lives that would never be the same once the truth came out. Hayes pulled around to the back of his diner, using his keys to let himself in through the rear entrance. The familiar kitchen, with its industrial stoves, steel prep tables, and walk-in freezer, looked the same as always. But everything had changed. This space, where he had prepared thousands of meals for the people of Millfield, was about to become the scene of an even more horrific crime. What Hayes did next elevated this case from a tragic murder to something that still makes veteran investigators sick to their stomachs decades later. In the kitchen of Hayes' family diner, the same kitchen where families had celebrated birthdays, where first dates had shared nervous conversations over burgers and milkshakes, where Michael himself had eaten lunch just hours before, Hayes began the systematic dismemberment of the boy's body. He used the same knives he used to slice roast beef and turkey for sandwiches, the same cutting boards where he chopped onions and tomatoes for burgers, the same steel prep tables where he kneaded dough for fresh bread every morning. Every tool, every surface that had been used to nourish the community was now being used for something unspeakably evil. But the most horrific part was still to come. Hayes wasn't just trying to dispose of evidence. He was planning something that would violate every principle of human decency. He took portions of Michael's remains and began incorporating them into the food he planned to serve the next day. Ground meat was mixed into hamburger patties that would be served with cheese and pickles to unsuspecting customers. Other portions were added to the big pot of chili that was always simmering on the back burner, a customer favorite that Hayes promoted as his secret recipe. Still more was prepared as part of the daily lunch special, seasoned and cooked with the same care Hayes applied to all his dishes. Think about that for a moment. This man had just murdered a child who trusted him completely, and now he was planning to use his restaurant, a place where that same child had felt safe and welcome, where families came to share meals and create memories, to dispose of the evidence in the most evil way imaginable. Hayes worked methodically through the night, cleaning up any trace of what he had done, preparing for the next day's business as if nothing had happened. By dawn, Hayes' family diner looked exactly the same as it always did. The floors were mopped, the surfaces sanitized, the coffee ready to brew. No one walking through that front door would have any idea that they were entering a chamber of horrors. The only evidence of the previous night's activities was carefully hidden in the walk-in freezer, wrapped in plastic and tucked behind cases of frozen French fries where no one would think to look. And of course, there was the special food that Hayes had prepared for his unsuspecting customers. As the sun rose over Millfield on Wednesday morning, July 24th, Robert Hayes showered, shaved, and put on a clean flannel shirt and jeans. He looked in the mirror and practiced his smile, the same warm, friendly expression that had fooled an entire community for years. In a few hours, that diner would be full of customers, and Hayes would greet each one with the same apparent sincerity he'd always shown. Wednesday morning dawned bright and clear, with temperatures already climbing toward another scorching day. Hayes' family diner opened at 6 a.m. sharp, just like it had every morning for the past 8 years. The familiar bell above the front door chimed as the first customers began filing in. Construction workers grabbing coffee and donuts before their shifts, mill workers stopping by for hearty breakfasts that would fuel them through another brutal day, retirees meeting for their daily gossip sessions over pancakes and bacon. Hayes greeted each customer with his trademark warmth and enthusiasm. He poured coffee before being asked, remembered how everyone liked their eggs, made small talk about the weather and the local baseball team's chances in the upcoming playoffs. To everyone who saw him that morning, he seemed exactly the same as always. Maybe a little tired, but nothing that would raise any suspicions. "Morning, Bob," said Jim Martinez, a police officer who'd been patrolling Millfield for 15 years. "Hot one today, isn't it?" "Sure is, Jim," Hayes replied, filling the officer's coffee cup. "Heard it might hit 95 again." "You be careful. Out there in that patrol car with no air conditioning." "Always do. Hey, can I get my usual? And make sure those hash browns are extra crispy." "You got it," Hayes said with a smile. Coming right up, it was a perfectly normal interaction between a long-time customer and a familiar business owner. Officer Martinez had no way of knowing that the man serving his breakfast had committed murder less than 12 hours earlier. None of them did. The morning rush continued as usual. Hayes worked with his typical efficiency, flipping pancakes, scrambling eggs, buttering toast. His one full-time waitress, Sally Peterson, handled the front of house while Hayes focused on the kitchen. Everything appeared completely normal. The lunch crowd brought even more customers, including several people who would later realize they had unknowingly participated in something unspeakable. The daily special was chili and cornbread, which Hayes promoted with his usual enthusiasm. "Made it fresh this morning," he told customer after customer. "Got some new ingredients I've been wanting to try. Think you'll really taste the difference." My. Those lunch customers were more members of the Millfield Police Department. Deputy Sheriff Karen Wells ordered a bowl of that special chili, complimenting Hayes on the unique flavor. Detective Linda Pierce stopped by for a quick burger between investigating a string of car break-ins on the north side of town. Even Fouad's Police Chief Robert Anderson came in for lunch, sitting at the counter while Hayes served him personally. "This chili's got a real depth of flavor to it, Bob," the police chief said between spoonfuls. "What's your secret?" Hayes smiled that same friendly smile. "Family recipe," he said. "Been perfecting it for years. Sometimes the best ingredients are the ones you'd never think to use." The most heartbreaking moment came around 2 p.m. when Michael's father, David Thompson, walked through the front door of Hayes' family diner. He looked exhausted and worried. Deep lines etched around his eyes, his work clothes wrinkled from a sleepless night. His son hadn't come home the previous evening, and the family was starting to panic. David had already called the lumber mill that morning, only to learn that both Michael and Danny had left work at their usual time. He'd driven around town looking for them, checked with other parents, even went by the community pool and the arcade where kids sometimes hung out. No one had seen either boy since Tuesday afternoon. "Hey, Bob," David said, his voice tight with anxiety. "You haven't seen my boy Michael around here today, have you? He didn't come home last night, and his mother's worried sick." Hayes looked David Thompson straight in the eye. This man whose son he had brutally murdered less than 24 hours earlier and lied without hesitation. His voice was steady, concerned, perfectly calibrated to sound helpful and sympathetic. "No, Dave, I haven't seen him since yesterday afternoon," Hayes said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Him and that Rodriguez boy had lunch here around noon, but that was the last I saw of them. They left to go back to work at the mill." "You check with the foreman?" "Yeah. I called Morrison's first thing this morning. They said both boys finished their shift and caught the 5:30 bus back to town. That's the last anyone saw of them." Hayes shook his head sympathetically. "That's not like Michael. He's such a responsible kid." "Have you called the police?" "Not yet," David admitted. "You know how it is. They usually want you to wait 24 hours before filing a missing person report. But I'm getting real worried. Bob, this just isn't like him." "I understand completely," Hayes said, his voice full of fake concern. "Tell you what, if either of those boys shows up here today, I'll call you immediately. And I'll keep my ears open, ask around if anyone's seen them." David nodded gratefully. "I appreciate that, Bob, really. Michael always speaks highly of you, says you've been real good to him and Danny." The irony was sickening. Here was a grieving father, desperate for information about his missing son, thanking the very man who had killed that son and was now serving him to customers as the lunch special. Hayes maintained his concerned expression, even placed a comforting hand on David's shoulder. "Michael's a great kid," Hayes said. "Smart, hard-working, respectful. You should be proud of the young man you're raising. I'm sure he's fine, probably. Just lost track of time somewhere. Kids that age, you know how it is." But even as Hayes offered these empty reassurances, he was calculating his next moves. How long before a real search effort began? How long before someone started asking the right questions? How long before they realized that the friendly diner owner wasn't what he seemed? David Thompson left the diner that afternoon having consumed part of his own murdered son, completely unaware of the horror he had just experienced. He would carry that unknowing violation with him for the rest of his life, a trauma so profound that it defied comprehension. By Wednesday evening, panic was setting in for both families. Neither Michael nor Danny had come home. Neither had called, And this was completely out of character for both boys. These were responsible teenagers who always let their parents know where they were, who had never stayed out all night without permission. Patricia Thompson paced their small living room, checking the window every few minutes as if willing her son to walk up the front path. She'd called every friend, every relative, every place Michael might have gone. The lumber mill, the community centre, even the hospital in case there had been an accident. Nothing. Maria Rodriguez was equally frantic. She'd spent the day calling Danny's school friends, driving around town looking for any sign of the boys, even checking the woods near their house in case they'd decided to go camping without telling anyone. By evening, she was on the verge of hysteria. David Thompson finally called the Millfield Police Department around 7 p.m. Within an hour, patrol cars were cruising through the small town, officers were knocking on doors, and word was spreading through the community that 2 local boys were missing. Detective Linda Pierce took charge of the investigation. She was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, someone who had worked everything from domestic disputes to drug busts to the occasional murder. But missing children cases always hit her the hardest, especially in a small town like Millfield, where she knew most of the families personally. "Tell me about yesterday," she said, sitting across from David and Patricia Thompson in their modest living room. "What was Michael's routine? Who did he see? Where did he go?" "Same as every day," David replied. "Caught the 5:45 bus to the mill. Worked his shift, came back to town on the 5:30 bus. He usually grabs lunch somewhere on Main Street during his break." "Any particular place?" "Lately, he's been going to Hayes' family diner a lot. Says Bob Hayes has been real good to him and Danny. Gives them extra food sometimes. Talks to them about their future." Detective Pierce made a note. Hayes' family diner. She'd eaten there herself plenty of times. Good food, friendly service, pillar of the community. But in missing persons cases, you had to check everything. "What about friends? Anyone he might have gone to see after work?" Patricia shook her head. "Michael doesn't really hang out with other kids much during the summer. He's been focused on work, saving money for his family. His best friend is Danny Rodriguez, and they're both missing." The search effort ramped up quickly. By Thursday morning, volunteers from all over Millfield and the surrounding communities had joined law enforcement in organizing search parties. They checked abandoned buildings, scoured the woods around town, followed up on any possible leads. Michael and Danny were well-liked kids from good families. The entire community rallied to help find them. Hayes participated in the search effort, of course. He joined one of the volunteer groups Thursday morning, spending hours walking through the woods around town, calling Michael's and Danny's names. He comforted their parents, offering words of hope and support. He even provided free coffee and sandwiches to the search teams, earning praise from community leaders for his generosity. During such a difficult time, Bob Hayes is what this community is all about, Mayor Janet Phillips told a reporter from the local newspaper. "Here's a man who's taking time away from his business to help search for these boys, even providing food for the volunteers. That's the kind of neighbor we all should be." The performance was flawless. Nobody suspected that the man leading prayers for the boys' safe return was the same man who had murdered one of them and was literally feeding him to the search team. Hayes walked through those woods knowing exactly where Michael's body wasn't going to be found, because he had hidden it in the last place anyone would think to look. Thursday afternoon brought more searchers and more desperation. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with photos of both boys, asking anyone with information to contact police immediately. Radio stations broadcast regular updates every hour. Missing person flyers were posted on every telephone pole and storefront window in town. But the most intensive search efforts were focused on the wrong areas. Everyone assumed the boys had gotten lost in the woods near town, maybe while hiking or exploring. No one thought to look 20 miles away, in the remote national forest where Hayes had taken them. No one suspected that the crime scene was in one of the most isolated spots in the entire region. As Thursday evening approached with no sign of either boy, the mood in Millfield grew increasingly grim. Parents began keeping their own children closer to home. The easy trust that had always characterized this small community was beginning to crack under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Thursday afternoon around 3:30 p.m., a miracle happened, at least partially. Tom Sullivan, a local rancher who lived about 15 miles outside of town, was driving his pickup truck along Forest Service Road 47 when he spotted something that made him hit the brake. There, stumbling along the side of the narrow dirt road, was what appeared to be a teenage boy. The kid was in terrible shape, clothes torn and dirty, face scratched and sunburned, moving with the unsteady gait of someone who was severely dehydrated and exhausted. Tom pulled over immediately and jumped out of his truck. As he got closer, he realized this was one of the missing boys, Danny Rodriguez, whose face had been all over the news for the past 2 days. "Son, are you okay?" Tom called out, approaching slowly so as not to startle the obviously traumatized teenager. "Are you Danny Rodriguez?" Danny looked up with wild, terrified eyes. He tried to speak but could only manage a hoarse whisper. "Help," he croaked. "Please help." Tom immediately called 911 on his cell phone, then wrapped Danny in a blanket he kept in his truck and gave him small sips of water. The boy was clearly in severe shock. He kept looking around fearfully, as if expecting danger to emerge from the forest at any moment. "Where's Michael?" Tom asked gently. "Where's your friend?" Danny's face crumpled and he began sobbing uncontrollably. Between gasps, he managed to say, "He's gone. He's gone. The man killed him." Within minutes, paramedics and police officers were racing toward the remote location. Detective Pierce was among the first to arrive, and she took one look at Danny's condition and knew they were dealing with something far worse than 2 boys who had simply gotten lost in the woods. Danny was rushed to Millfield General Hospital, where doctors treated him for severe dehydration, exposure, and multiple lacerations from pushing through thick underbrush. But his physical injuries were nothing compared to the psychological trauma he had suffered. The boy was exhibiting classic symptoms of severe PTSD, hypervigilance, panic attacks, and inability to maintain eye contact with adults. Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital's child psychologist, was called in immediately. She had 20 years of experience dealing with traumatized children, but she'd rarely seen a case this severe. Danny was so terrified that he could barely speak coherently. When he did manage to say a few words, they were fragmented and difficult to understand. "There was a man," Danny whispered during one of his more lucid moments. "A bad man. He hurt Michael. He hurt him bad." "What man, Danny?" Dr. Chen asked gently. "Can you tell me who it was?" But Danny would just shake his head and retreat back into silence, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for threats that weren't there. Detective Pierce was eager to question Danny, hoping he could provide crucial information about Michael's whereabouts and what had happened to both boys. But Dr. Chen insisted on taking things slowly. Pushing too hard, too fast could re-traumatize the boy and potentially make him shut down completely. "This child has been through something horrific," she told Detective Pierce. "We need to give him time to feel safe before we can expect him to relive whatever happened to him." It was a delicate balance. The urgent need to find Michael warring against the equally important need to protect Danny's fragile mental state. Every hour that passed made it less likely that Michael would be found alive. But rushing Danny's recovery could cost them their only witness to whatever had occurred. It took nearly 48 hours of patient, careful work before Danny was able to tell his story coherently. Dr. Chen used every technique in her arsenal: art therapy, play therapy, medication to help with his anxiety, to help the traumatized boy process what he had experienced. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. Danny's first breakthrough came when Dr. Chen asked him to draw a picture of where he'd been. With shaking hands, he sketched a clearing surrounded by tall trees, a red truck parked in the middle, and 2 stick figures, one lying on the ground, one running away. "Can you tell me about this picture, Danny?" Dr. Chen asked softly. "That's where the bad man took us," Danny whispered, pointing to the clearing. "That's where he hurt Mike." "What bad man? Do you know his name?" Danny nodded slowly, then said the words that would change everything. "Mr. Hayes, from the diner. He seemed nice, but he wasn't nice. He was bad. Really, really." Detective Pierce, who had been observing from behind a one-way mirror, felt her blood run cold. Robert Hayes, the beloved diner owner, the man who had been helping with the search effort, the pillar of the community who had fed half the police department over the years. It seemed impossible, but the boy's terror was absolutely genuine. Over The next several hours, Danny was able to provide more details. He described how Hayes had offered them a ride home from the diner, how he had driven them to the remote forest location instead, how his entire demeanor had changed once they were isolated. He recounted Michael's desperate attempt to escape, the horrible sounds he had heard from his hiding place, and the long, terrifying night he had spent alone in the woods. "I wanted to help him," Danny sobbed. "I wanted to save Michael, but I was too scared. I hid like a coward while my best friend was dying." Dr. Chen assured him that he had done the only thing he could have done, that trying to fight Hayes would have likely resulted in both boys being killed. But Danny's guilt was overwhelming, a burden that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Detective Pierce now had what she needed: the location of the crime scene and the identity of the perpetrator. But she also faced a dilemma. Hayes had been actively participating in the search effort, had shown no signs of guilt or suspicious behavior. How could she investigate him without tipping him off? The decision was made to conduct surveillance on Hayes, while simultaneously sending a forensics team to search the location Danny had described. If they could find physical evidence at the crime scene, they would have probable cause to search Hayes's property and potentially arrest him. Friday morning, while Hayes was busy serving breakfast to his regular customers, a team of investigators was making the 20-mile drive to Forest Service Road 47. What they found in that remote clearing would confirm Danny's testimony in every horrific detail. The forensics team arrived at the clearing around 10 a.m. on Friday morning, led by Detective Pierce and accompanied by specialists from the State Crime Lab. The location matched Danny's description perfectly: a small open area surrounded by towering Douglas fir trees, accessible only by the narrow dirt road that wound through some of the most remote wilderness in the region. Even before they began their detailed examination, the investigators could see signs that something violent had occurred here. The ground in the center of the clearing was disturbed, with drag marks visible in the dirt. Scattered around the area were items that clearly belonged to the missing boys: pieces of torn clothing, a sneaker, Michael's wallet with his learner's permit still inside. Crime scene photographer Janet Morrison documented everything with meticulous care, her camera capturing evidence that would later be crucial in court. Each piece of torn fabric, each scuff mark in the dirt, each drop of dried blood told part of the story of what had happened here. The forensics specialists worked in methodical silence, collecting samples and measurements, looking for any trace evidence that might have been left behind. What they found painted a clear picture of a violent struggle. Blood spatter patterns indicated that someone had been severely injured in this location. Footprint impressions in the soft earth showed at least 3 different sets of shoes: 2 smaller sets that matched the sizes worn by Michael and Danny, and 1 larger set consistent with adult male footwear. But perhaps most importantly, they found clear tire tracks leading into and out of the clearing. The impressions were deep and well preserved in the soft forest floor, and they matched the distinctive tread pattern of the tires on Hayes's red Ford pickup truck. Detective Pierce stood at the edge of the clearing, surveying the scene and trying to imagine the terror those 2 boys must have felt when they realized they were in mortal danger. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. Hayes had deliberately driven them to this isolated location, far from any possibility of help or rescue. "This is definitely our primary crime scene," she told the forensics team leader. "But we need to find Michael's body." Danny said Hayes drove away with it, which means he took it somewhere else. The search of the immediate area turned up no sign of Michael's remains, confirming that Hayes had indeed transported the body to another location. The question now was where. In a case like this, the perpetrator usually tried to hide the evidence as far away as possible from the crime scene and from their own home or business. But as Detective Pierce was about to learn, Robert Hayes was not like most perpetrators. His plan for disposing of Michael's body was so audacious, so unthinkably evil, that it would shock even veteran investigators who thought they had seen it. By early Friday afternoon, the forensics team had collected everything they could from the crime scene. They had physical evidence linking Hayes to the location. They had Danny's eyewitness testimony, and they had a clear understanding of what had happened in those woods. Now it was time to confront the monster who had been hiding in plain sight. Detective Pierce obtained search warrants for both Hayes Family Diner and Hayes's personal residence. She wanted to execute both searches simultaneously, preventing Hayes from having any opportunity to destroy evidence or flee. The plan was to have one team search his house while another team searched the restaurant, with Hayes himself being detained during both searches. Friday afternoon around 4 p.m., as Hayes was preparing for the dinner rush, Detective Pierce walked into the diner accompanied by 3 other officers. The few customers who were there looked up in surprise as the police officers approached the counter where Hayes was wiping down coffee cups. "Robert Hayes," Detective Pierce said in a clear, authoritative voice. "You're under arrest for the murder of Michael Thompson and the kidnapping of Danny Rodriguez." For a split second, Hayes's mask slipped. The friendly facade fell away, replaced by something cold and calculating. But then, just as quickly, he seemed to regain his composure. "There must be some mistake," he said, setting down the coffee cup he'd been holding. "I don't know what you're talking about. Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Detective Pierce ordered, pulling out her handcuffs. Hayes complied without resistance, but his mind was clearly racing. As the handcuffs clicked shut, he asked, "Can I at least know what this is about? What exactly are you accusing me of?" "We found the crime scene, Mr. Hayes. We know what you did to those boys in the woods." Hayes's face went completely pale, but he said nothing more. As Detective Pierce led him toward the front door of the diner, the remaining customers stared in shock. This was Bob Hayes, the man who had served them coffee every morning for years, the friendly neighbor who remembered their birthdays and asked about their family. It was impossible to reconcile that image with the accusations they were hearing. While Hayes was being transported to the police station, the forensics team began their search of the diner. They started with the kitchen, looking for any signs that it had been used for something other than food preparation. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their career. In the walk-in freezer, hidden behind cases of frozen French fries and tucked into a corner where it wouldn't be noticed during normal operations, they discovered human remains wrapped in heavy plastic bags. The packages were labeled with dates and contents in Hayes's own handwriting, as if he were organizing inventory for his restaurant. But that discovery, horrific as it wasn't the worst part. The forensics team also collected samples of food from throughout the kitchen. Leftover chili from the big pot that was always simmering on the back burner, ground beef from the walk-in cooler, soup stock that had been prepared earlier in the week. When these samples were rushed to the state crime lab for analysis, the results confirmed everyone's worst fear. Hayes had mixed Michael's remains into the food he had served to customers over the previous 3 days. The chili that had been praised by Police Chief Anderson contained human flesh. The hamburgers that had been served to dozens of unsuspecting customers were contaminated with the remains of a murdered child. The daily lunch specials that Hayes had promoted so enthusiastically were vehicles for the most unthinkable crime imaginable. Detective Pierce, who had worked homicide cases for over 15 years, had to step outside and vomit when she received the lab results. The crime scene photographer broke down and cried. Even the medical examiner, someone who dealt with death every day, said it was the most disturbing case he had ever encountered. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just murder. It was a violation of everything sacred about community, trust, and basic human decency. Hayes had turned his restaurant, the heart of Millfield's social life, into an instrument of unimaginable horror. He had forced an entire community to unknowingly participate in the desecration of a murdered child. When Detective Pierce and FBI agent Robert Chen sat down across from Hayes in the interrogation room at the Millfield police station, they expected to face hours of denials, demands for a lawyer, and the typical cat-and-mouse game that characterized most murder investigations. Instead, they encountered something far more disturbing, a man who seemed almost relieved that his secret was finally out. "I suppose you're here about the Thompson boy," Hayes said calmly, before either investigator had spoken a word. He sat, with his hands folded on the metal table, looking more like a businessman discussing a contract than a murder suspect facing a potential death sentence. "Tell us what happened, Mr. Hayes," Detective Pierce said, her voice carefully controlled, despite the revulsion she felt. Hayes shrugged, as if the question were about something as mundane as the weather. "The boys were getting too comfortable around me, too trusting. Michael especially. He was starting to ask questions, wanting to know more about my personal life. I could see he was beginning to suspect something wasn't quite right. Suspect. What? Agent Chen asked. That I wasn't who I pretended to be, Hayes replied matter-of-fact. That my interest in them wasn't as innocent as they thought. Over the next 3 hours, Hayes provided a detailed confession that shocked even veteran investigators. He described how he had been planning the crime for weeks, studying the boys' routines, learning their schedules, identifying the perfect opportunity to get them alone. The friendly diner owner persona had been a carefully crafted facade designed to gain their trust. I've been watching children for years, Hayes said with chilling casualness, learning their patterns, their vulnerabilities. Michael and Danny were perfect, hard-working boys from struggling families, mature for their age, isolated from their peer groups because of their summer jobs. They were grateful for adult attention, hungry for approval and guidance. When Detective Pierce asked about the murder itself, Hayes showed no emotion, no remorse, no recognition of the magnitude of what he had done. He described the crime in clinical terms, as if he were discussing a business transaction. Michael fought harder than I expected, he said. Strong boy, good muscles from working at the mill. But fear makes people clumsy, and I had the advantage of surprise. What about Danny? Agent Chen. Did you try to find him in? Hayes shook his head. I heard him running away, but it was too dark to track him effectively. I figured he was too scared to come back, and I was right. By the time I finished with Michael, I had other priorities. The most disturbing part of the confession came when Hayes described what he had done with Michael's body. He spoke about the dismemberment and disposal with the same casual tone he might use to describe preparing a daily special. I had to get rid of the evidence, he said when asked about incorporating the remains into the restaurant's food. It seemed like the most efficient method. People eat what I serve them without question. They trust me. It was actually quite simple. Detective Pierce had to excuse herself from the interrogation room twice to compose herself. The word efficient, the way Hayes reduced a child's murder to a question of operational logistics, was something that would stay with her for years. Do you understand what you've done? She asked when she returned. Do you comprehend the horror you've inflicted on this community? Hayes looked genuinely puzzled by the question. I solved a problem, he said. Michael was becoming a liability, and I dealt with it in a way that eliminated any potential evidence. From a practical standpoint, it was quite successful. The complete absence of remorse, the inability to recognize the human cost of his actions, the casual way he discussed the murder and desecration of a child, it all pointed to a level of psychopathy that was both rare and terrifying. Word of Hayes's arrest and confession spread through Millfield like wildfire. Within hours, crowds had gathered outside the police station and the closed diner, their faces showing a mixture of disbelief, rage, and revulsion that defied description. The initial reaction was denial. Surely there had been some mistake. Bob Hayes, the man who had served them coffee every morning and remembered their children's names, couldn't possibly be capable of such unthinkable evil. But as the details began to leak out, denial turned to horror and then to fury. The revelation that dozens of people had unknowingly consumed human remains sent shockwaves through the community that would last for years. People who had eaten at the diner during those 3 crucial days became physically ill when they learned what they might have endured. The Millfield General Hospital emergency room was flooded with people suffering from severe anxiety attacks, panic disorders, and trauma-related symptoms. I can't stop thinking about it, said Martha Williams, a retired teacher who had eaten the chili special on Wednesday afternoon. Every time I close my eyes, I see that poor boy's face. How do you live with something like that? How do you ever eat again without wondering? The diner itself became a focal point for the community's. Someone threw a brick through the front window Thursday night, shattering the glass and leaving a spider web of cracks across the surface. By Friday morning, the building was covered with graffiti, most of it unprintable, but all of it expressing the anger and betrayal felt by Hayes's former customer. Local churches organized emergency counseling sessions for community members, struggling to process what had happened. Pastor James Morrison of First Methodist Church had worked with grieving families for over 20 years, but he'd never encountered trauma on this scale. "This goes beyond normal grief," he explained to a reporter from the regional newspaper. "When someone violates the most basic bonds of trust and community in such a horrific way, it damages something fundamental in people's ability to feel safe in the world." Michael's family was devastated beyond words. Not only had they lost their son to a brutal murder, but they had to live with the knowledge that his killer had fed him, including to Michael's own father, who had unknowingly consumed part of his murdered son while desperately searching for answers about the boy's disappearance. The psychological impact extended far beyond those who had directly eaten at the diner. The knowledge that their trusted neighbor, the man who had served food to their children and grandchildren for years, had been capable of such evil, created a collective trauma that affected the entire town. Property values in Millfield dropped significantly in the months following the. Many families moved away, unable to continue living in a place that held such terrible memories. The town's population decreased by nearly 20% over the following 5 years, as people sought fresh starts in communities that hadn't been touched by such horror. But even those who stayed found their lives fundamentally changed. Parents became hyperprotective of their children. Local businesses implemented strict policies about employee interactions with minors, and the easy trust that had always characterized relationships in the small town was replaced by suspicion and wary. The case also had broader implications for how communities view the people they trust with their children. Hayes had passed every background check, had no criminal history, and had been a respected member of the community for decades. His crime served as a chilling reminder that evil could hide behind the most ordinary, trustworthy facades. Hayes's trial began in March 1997, nearly 8 months after Michael's murder. The delay had been necessary to allow the prosecution time to build their overwhelming case and for the community to heal enough to provide an impartial jury, though finding 12 people in the region who hadn't been affected by the case proved nearly impossible. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Foster, had an abundance of evidence. They had Danny's eyewitness testimony, physical evidence from the crime scene, forensic evidence from the restaurant, and Hayes's own detailed confession. It should have been a straightforward case, but the defense team introduced complications. That would make the trial far more complex than anyone anticipated. Hayes's attorneys, a team of experienced criminal defense lawyers from Portland, argued that their client was mentally ill and should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about various personality disorders, psychotic breaks, and dissociative episodes. They painted a picture of a man who had lost touch with reality and couldn't be held responsible for his. Dr. Amanda Richardson, a forensic psychiatrist hired by the defense, testified that Hayes exhibited signs of severe antisocial personality disorder combined with psychotic episodes that would have impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong. Mr. Hayes was operating under a complex system of delusions, she told the jury. In his mind, he was solving problems and protecting himself from perceived threats. The rational, calculating behavior that the prosecution describes was actually the product of a deeply disturbed psychological state, but the prosecution's psychiatric experts disagreed completely. Dr. Michael Chen, a renowned forensic psychologist, testified that while Hayes was clearly disturbed, he understood the nature of his actions and the difference between right and wrong throughout the commission of his crime. This defendant showed clear evidence of planning, premeditation, and sophisticated attempts to conceal his crimes, Dr. Chen explained to the jury. His ability to maintain his public facade while serving contaminated food to customers, his methodical disposal of evidence, and his calculated responses during police interviews all demonstrate that he knew exactly what he was doing and that it was wrong. Danny's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Now 15 years old and still clearly traumatized by his experience, he took the witness stand and described that terrible night in the woods with heartbreaking detail. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom as this brave young man recounted, watching his best friend's murder while hiding in terror behind a. "I wanted to help Michael," Danny said, his voice breaking as he. "I wanted to run back and save him, but I was too scared. I could hear him calling for help, and I just hid there like a coward." The defense attorney tried to challenge Danny's testimony, suggesting that darkness and trauma might have affected his memory of the events. But the young man was unshakable in his account, and the physical evidence supported every detail of his story. "Are you absolutely certain it was Mr. Hayes who killed your friend?" the prosecutor asked during redirect examination. Danny looked directly at Hayes, who sat emotionless at the defense table. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'll never forget his face. I'll never forget what he did to me." The forensic evidence was equally compelling. DNA testing confirmed that the remains found in Hayes's freezer belonged to Michael Thompson. Laboratory analysis proved that human tissue had been mixed into food served at the restaurant. Tire tracks from the crime scene matched Hayes's pickup truck perfectly. Perhaps most damning was Hayes's own confession, played for the jury. The recording captured not just his admission of guilt, but his complete lack of remorse and his casual attitude toward the suffering he had. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and multiple health code violations related to serving contaminated food. The sentencing phase was even more emotional than the Oregon law allowed for victim impact statements, giving Michael's family and other affected community members the opportunity to address Hayes directly about the pain. Patricia Thompson, Michael's mother, was the first to speak. She had aged years in the months since her son's murder, her once vibrant face now etched with lines of grief and "Michael was going to be an engineer," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He was always taking things apart to see how they worked, always building something in our garage. He had plans, dreams, a whole life ahead of him. He wanted to design bridges, buildings that would help people and make the world better." She looked directly at Hayes, who stared back with empty eyes. "You didn't just kill my son," she continued. "You stole his future, his dreams, everything he might have become. And you did it to an entire community that trusted you, that welcomed you into their lives and their." David Thompson spoke next, describing the unique horror of learning that he had unknowingly consumed part of his murdered son while searching for answers about. "The worst part isn't just that you killed Michael," he said, his voice thick with "It's that you made us all participants in desecrating his body. You forced people who loved him to unknowingly violate his memory in the most horrible way imaginable. That's a cruelty that goes beyond anything." Danny also testified about the lasting impact of witnessing his best. Now 16 years old and receiving intensive therapy, he described nightmares that left him screaming in the middle of the night, panic attacks that struck without warning, and an inability to trust adults or form normal relations. "I think about Michael every single day," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wonder what he would be doing now, what kind of man he would have become. And I think about that night in the woods and how I couldn't save him. That's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Community members also spoke about the broader impact. Teachers described students who were afraid to eat lunch at school. Business owners talked about the economic devastation that had hit Millfield as families moved away and tourism disappeared. Religious leaders discussed the spiritual crisis that had engulfed. When it came time for sentencing, Judge Margaret Foster didn't. She had presided over hundreds of criminal cases during her 20-year career on the bench, but nothing had prepared her for the scope of evil she had witnessed during this. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute. "You have committed crimes so heinous, so fundamentally evil, that they challenge our basic understanding of human nature. You not only took the life of an innocent child who trusted you, but you violated that trust and the trust of an entire community in ways that will cause suffering for generations to." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over. "The law provides for various punishments, but in this case, there is only one sentence that reflects the magnitude of your crimes. You will spend the rest of your natural life in prison, without the possibility of. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court certainly will not." Hayes showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced. No remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, no recognition that he had destroyed countless lives with his. He was led away in shackles, a hollow shell of a human being who had forfeited any claim to sympathy or understanding. As the courtroom, many of those present felt a sense of justice served, but also a recognition that no punishment could truly balance the scales of what Hayes had done. Michael Thompson was still dead. Danny Rodriguez was still traumatized, and the community of Millfield was still. The legal system had done what it could, but the real work of healing would take years, perhaps decades. Today, more than 27 years after Michael Thompson's murder, Robert Hayes remains incarcerated at Oregon. Now 70 years old, his health is declining according to prison records. He has never expressed remorse for his actions, never provided a satisfactory explanation for why he committed such horrific crimes, and never shown any recognition of the pain he caused to. Prison officials describe Hayes as a model inmate, quiet, compliant, keeping to himself. He works in the prison library, has never been involved in any incidents, and rarely receives visitors. To his fellow inmates, many of whom are serving time for violent crimes themselves, Hayes is an object of particular revulsion. Even among murderers and rapists, his crimes are considered. Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychologist who has studied Hayes's case extensively, believes his behavior in prison is consistent with his person. He's not reformed or rehabilitated, she explains. He simply has no reason to act out because his current environment doesn't provide opportunities for the kind of predatory behavior he engaged in before. If he were released tomorrow, I believe he would pose the same danger to society that he did in 1996. The case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches missing children cases, particularly in small communities where everyone assumes they know their neighbors. Hayes had passed every background check, had no criminal history, and had been a respected member of the community. His crimes demonstrated that evil could hide behind the most ordinary. The Hayes case taught us that we can never take anyone's innocence for granted, says Detective Linda Pierce, who has since retired but still speaks about the case at law enforcement conferences. We learn to look deeper, to question assumptions, and to never dismiss a child's fears or concerns about an adult, no matter how respected that adult might be in the community. The building that once housed Hayes' family diner sat empty for years after the. Despite being thoroughly cleaned, renovated, and even blessed by local religious leaders, no one wanted to operate a business there. It became a constant reminder of the horror that had taken place, a wound in the heart of Main Street that refused to. Local officials tried various approaches to deal with. They offered tax incentives to potential buyers, considered turning it into a community center, even explored the possibility of converting it into a memorial. But nothing worked. The building's history was too dark, too closely associated with unthinkable. Finally, in 2003, the city council voted to have the process took several days, with crews working carefully to remove every trace of the building from the landscape. Many residents gathered to watch, seeing the demolition as a necessary step in the community's healing process. The lot where the diner once stood is now a small memorial park dedicated to Michael's memory. A simple granite bench sits under a young oak tree with a bronze plaque that reads, "In memory." A young man whose dreams were cut short, but whose spirit lives on in the love of his family and community. Danny Rodriguez eventually moved away from Millfield with his family, seeking a fresh start in a place where he wouldn't be constantly reminded of that terrible. The decision wasn't easy. The Rodriguez family had deep roots in the community, and Carlos had worked hard to establish his construction business there. But Danny's psychological well-being had to take priority. The family relocated to Sacramento, California, where Danny could receive specialized treatment for his severe PTSD while starting over in a new school where nobody knew his story. The transition was difficult. Danny struggled with nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to trust adults or form normal relationships with. For years, I couldn't be alone with any adult man, Danny revealed in a rare interview on the 20th anniversary of the crime. Teachers, coaches, even my own relatives, I would panic if I found myself in a room alone with them. The therapists said it was a normal response to trauma, but it made normal life almost slowly. With intensive therapy and the unwavering support of his family, Danny began to heal. He discovered that art, specifically graphic design, provided an outlet for processing his emotions and trauma. Through drawing and digital design, he could express feelings that he couldn't put in. Danny graduated from high school with honors and went on to study graphic design at the California. His senior thesis project was a powerful series of digital illustrations exploring themes of survival, trauma, and healing. The work caught the attention of several major advertising agencies, launching what would become a successful career. Today, Danny is a respected graphic designer living in San Francisco, married to a therapist named Lisa, whom he met during his own continued counseling sessions. They have 2 children, a daughter named Michelle, in honor of his lost friend Michael, and a son named David. Danny has been very careful about protecting his children from knowledge of his traumatic past, but he's also made sure they understand the importance of trusting their instincts about adults and never being afraid to speak up if something feels wrong. "I want my kids to have the innocence that was stolen from me," Danny explains. "But I also want them to be smart, to be aware, to know that not all adults who seem friendly actually have good intentions." Danny rarely speaks publicly about the Hayes case, preferring to focus on moving forward rather than reliving the past. However, he has occasionally worked with law enforcement agencies, helping to train officers who work with traumatized child witnesses. His insights into the psychology of surviving extreme trauma have been valuable in improving how the justice system handles. Michael's family, the Thompsons, chose to stay in Millfield and fight for their community's healing rather than flee from. It was a decision that required tremendous courage and strength, particularly given the unique horror of learning that David had unknowingly consumed part of his murder. Patricia Thompson threw herself into victim advocacy work, becoming a powerful voice for families affected by violent crime. She testified before the state legislature about the need for better support services for crime victims, helped establish new protocols for notifying families about the details of their loved ones' deaths, and worked tirelessly to ensure that other families wouldn't have to navigate the system. "Grief is something you learn to carry, not something you get over," Patricia said during a speech at a national conference on victims. "But you can choose whether that grief becomes a force for good or a force for destruction. I chose to honor Michael's memory by trying to help other families avoid some of the additional trauma we experienced." David Thompson struggled more privately with his trauma, the knowledge that he had unknowingly consumed part of his murdered son while desperately searching for answers created a form of psychological torment that few people could understand. He entered intensive therapy and also found solace in his faith, working closely with Pastor Morrison to process the spiritual implications of what had. Together, the Thompsons established the Michael Thompson Foundation, providing support to families of murdered children. The foundation offers practical assistance, help with funeral expenses, therapy costs, legal fees, as well as emotional support through peer. Over the years, they've helped hundreds of families navigate the impossible journey of losing a. The foundation also funds educational programs in schools, teaching children about personal safety without traumatizing them with frightening details. The programs focus on trusting instincts, understanding appropriate versus inappropriate adult behavior, and knowing that it's always okay to say no to an adult. "Michael was such a responsible, helpful kid," Patricia explains. "He would have grown up to be someone who helped others, who made the world better. Through the foundation, we're trying to continue that work for him." The Thompsons also became advocates for changes in how restaurants and food service establishments are. Michael's case revealed gaps in the system that allowed Hayes to operate his business without adequate oversight. The family pushed for stronger health department inspections, better background checks for food service workers, and clearer protocols for investigating suspicious circumstances at restaurants. Millfield's recovery from the Hayes case was neither quick nor easy. The trauma affected virtually every family in the small community, creating ripple effects that lasted for years. Many longtime residents struggled with feelings of guilt and betrayal. How had they been so completely fooled by Hayes? How had they failed to protect their children from such a monster? The economic impact was also severe. Tourism, which had been a small but steady source of income for local businesses, virtually disappeared as the town became associated with one of the most horrific crimes. Property values plummeted as families moved away, and several businesses on Main Street were forced to close. But gradually, slowly, the community. New families moved in, drawn by affordable housing prices and the small-town atmosphere. These newcomers, who hadn't lived through the original trauma, brought fresh energy and perspectives that helped balance the lingering. The high school, where both Michael and Danny had been students, implemented new counseling programs and safety protocols. Guidance counselors received additional training in recognizing signs of trauma and abuse. Teachers learned to be more aware of changes in student behavior that might indicate problems at home. Local churches played a crucial role in the healing process, organizing support groups, community meals, and interfaith services focused on forgiveness and renewal. Pastor Morrison, who had counseled dozens of families affected by the case, became a local leader in trauma recovery. "We learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting," Pastor Morrison explains. "It means learning to carry our pain in a way that doesn't destroy us, and finding ways to use our experience to protect others and build a stronger community." The annual Millfield Community Festival, which had been cancelled for several years after the murder, was eventually revived with a new focus on celebrating resilience. And the festival now includes a memorial service for Michael and other community members who have died, as well as fundraising activities for the Michael. New businesses gradually opened on Main Street, including a coffee shop run by a young couple from Portland who were drawn to Millfield's story of survival and renewal. The building that once housed Hayes Family Diner was replaced by the Memorial Park, which has become a place where residents gather for quiet reflection. "We're not the same town we were before 1996, says current Mayor Robert Chen, no relation to the FBI agent who worked. "We're more cautious, more aware, but also we know we can survive something unthinkable and The Hayes case serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. Robert Hayes wasn't a stereotypical monster lurking in dark alleys. He was a neighbor, a business owner, someone people trusted with their children and their secrets. He served them food, remembered their birthdays, asked about their families, and earned their complete trust over many years. The horror of his crimes lies not just in their brutality, but in the complete betrayal of that trust. Hayes didn't just kill Michael Thompson. He violated the fundamental bonds that hold communities together. He turned a place of nourishment and fellowship into an instrument of unspeakable evil. The case also demonstrated the incredible resilience. Danny Rodriguez survived an unimaginable ordeal and found the courage to testify against his friend's killer, ensuring the Thompson family transformed their grief into a force for good, helping other families navigate similar tragedies. The community of Millfield, though forever changed, found ways to heal and rebuild while honoring their life. Perhaps most importantly, the case taught law enforcement and child protection professionals valuable lessons about predatory behavior. Hayes had spent months building trust with Michael and Danny, gradually isolating them from their peer groups and making them dependent on his approval and attention. Understanding these patterns has helped investigators identify and stop other predators before. The woods around Millfield are quiet now, but they carry the echoes of that terrible summer night in 1996. Visitors to the Memorial Park where Hayes Family Diner once stood often comment on the peaceful atmosphere, unaware of the darkness that once dwelt there. The oak tree has grown tall and strong, its branches providing shade for families who gather to remember not just Michael Thompson, but all the victims. As I finish telling you this story, I want to acknowledge once again the incredible courage of Danny Rodriguez, whose survival and testimony ensured that Robert Hayes could. Danny's bravery not only brought a killer to justice, but also provided closure for a grieving family and a traumatized. Michael Thompson's memory lives on in his family, his community, and in the lessons learned from this tragedy. While we can never fully understand what drives someone to commit such acts, we can honor the victims by remembering their stories, supporting their families, and working tirelessly to protect other. The case of the Millfield monster reminds us that vigilance is the price of safety, that trust must be earned and verified, and that even in the darkest circumstances, The human capacity for love, courage, and healing can triumph over evil. Michael Thompson was taken from this world far too soon, but his legacy lives on in every child who is protected, every family that receives support in their darkest hour, and every community that chooses. Sometimes the most horrific stories are the ones that really happened, serving as stark reminders that evil can wear a friendly face and serve you lunch with a smile. But they also remind us of our capacity to survive, to heal, and to build something beautiful from the ashes of unthinkable tragedy.